Father, they say Japan will lead Asia, but who will lead Japan's soul? The words, penned by a naval cadet in 1905, capture the paradox of a nation at the crossroads of destiny. From the ashes of isolation, Japan had risen to challenge the giants of the West. The Meiji Restoration had transformed a samurai kingdom into an industrial empire, its eyes fixed on the horizon, hungry for recognition, power, and survival. Steamships now lined Yokohama's docks. Telegraph wires hummed across cities once lit by candlelight. Trains roared where rice fields once whispered in the wind. Japan, reborn from the embers of humiliation, vowed never again to kneel before foreign powers. The victory over Russia in 1905 shocked the world, the first time an Asian nation had defeated a European empire in modern warfare. The rising sun was no longer a poetic emblem. It was a symbol of momentum. But behind that brilliance, ambition cast a long shadow. By the 1930s, Japan's energy had turned feverish. The population swelled beyond what its islands could feed. Coal and steel factories demanded fuel, and the empire's lifeblood, oil, flowed from foreign lands. The Western powers controlled those lifelines, and their colonial empires stretched across Asia like chains. In Tokyo's military academies, whispers hardened into doctrine: Japan must strike or starve. Tokyo, 1931. The Great Depression gripped the world like an iron fist. In Japan, factories shut their doors, farmers starved, and despair filled the streets. A merchant's letter read, "Rice is twice the price. The children eat once a day. Ships no longer bring oil. We are prisoners of the West." While politicians debated, the military acted. The Kwantung Army invaded Manchuria under the guise of self-defense, toppling the fragile peace. It was not sanctioned by Tokyo, but the generals knew something the politicians didn't. The public craved victory. When Japan seized Manchuria, the newspapers erupted in celebration. "Our soldiers have brought pride to Asia," they proclaimed. Across the empire, young men volunteered by the thousands, ready to serve what they called the divine destiny of the nation. But in the dark alleys of Shanghai and Nanjing, the first cracks appeared. The illusion of liberation gave way to occupation and brutality. Civilians became casualties of ambition. The conquest that promised prosperity delivered chaos. Meanwhile, in Europe, the winds of another storm were rising. Hitler's speeches echoed across radios, Mussolini's armies marched into Africa, and the world drifted toward the edge of total war. Japan watched closely. It had learned from the West. Now it was determined to surpass it. By 1937, the invasion of China had turned into an endless nightmare. Entire cities were engulfed in bloodshed. Soldiers fought street to street, house to house, bayonet to bayonet. The world was horrified by reports of atrocities in Nanjing, hundreds of thousands of civilians slaughtered. Yet Tokyo censored the news, insisting it was all lies spun by the West. In truth, Japan's moral compass had collapsed under the weight of its ambition. By 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. The Axis powers were born. It was a pact not only of strategy but of ideology, a shared belief that destiny belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Yet Japan's leaders remained torn. The army sought dominance on the Asian mainland. The Navy saw the Pacific as their stage. In this silent rivalry lay the seeds of catastrophe. The United States watched from afar, uneasy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt imposed sanctions, freezing Japanese assets and halting vital oil exports. Japan's empire, now spanning China, Korea, and Taiwan, found itself strangled. Desperation grew. Without oil, ships would stop, planes would rust, tanks would be silent. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of Japan's most brilliant minds and a man educated at Harvard, understood the stakes. In a private letter, he warned, "If we must fight, we can win for 6 months. Beyond that, I can promise nothing." He knew the might of America's industry. But Japan's war cabinet saw no alternative. In their minds, surrender to sanctions meant national death. So they made a choice, a gambler's choice. They would strike first, hard, fast, and hope the world would fall before it could rise. From the skies over Hawaii to the jungles of the Philippines, the Empire of Japan prepared for the boldest military gamble in modern history. As diplomacy falters, secret fleets cross the Pacific under radio silence. In Washington, messages pile up unheeded. And in Tokyo, Yamamoto's hand trembles over the map, a single decision away from destiny. Autumn, 1941. A storm was brewing across an ocean that spanned half the world. The Pacific, vast, blue, and silent, hid beneath its surface the machinery of fate. In Tokyo, beneath paper lanterns and the incense smoke of government offices, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo lit a cigarette and studied a map that stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the coast of Australia. Red pins marked potential targets. Blue lines traced shipping routes now blocked by embargoes. Oil, rubber, steel, the veins of empire were drying up. For months, Japan's diplomats had pleaded with Washington to lift the sanctions strangling their economy. But President Roosevelt's cabinet held firm. America demanded Japan withdraw from China and respect international law. Conditions. Tokyo viewed as humiliation. Tojo's words to the War Council were clear. A man pushed to starvation does not debate manners. Japan will secure her own destiny, even if the heavens fall. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, the United States continued to underestimate Japan's resolve. In the marble halls of the State Department, analysts believed Japan would never dare attack America, not with such a small industrial base, not with its fragile oil reserves. But in a dimly lit naval cabin on the battleship Nagato, one man thought differently. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy, understood the peril of this gamble. Having studied at Harvard and served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, he knew the power of American industry and the spirit of its people. "If I am ordered to fight," he confided to a friend, "I will run wild for 6 months. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Despite his doubts, Yamamoto began planning an operation so daring that even his subordinates doubted its feasibility. Its name was whispered in code: Operation Z, a surprise attack to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor before it could ever strike back. Across Japan's naval yards, shipbuilders worked day and night under floodlights. 6 aircraft carriers were modified for a mission unlike any before. A carrier-based assault across 4,000 miles of open sea. Mechanics painted planes with the red circle of the rising sun, while priests performed Shinto blessings over the decks. Pilots trained in secrecy, landing on short runways simulating carrier decks. They learned to dive, torpedo, and strike in synchronized waves. Among them were men barely 20, writing farewell letters home, their words filled with duty and doubt. "Mother, do not cry. If I fall, it is for Japan's future. The sea will remember my name." In Washington, the signs were there, hidden in plain sight. American cryptographers had broken parts of Japan's diplomatic code. Cables hinted that Tokyo was preparing for something extraordinary, yet no one could see the full picture. A memo dated December 3, 1941, warned, "An attack is possible in the Pacific. Exact location unknown." But in the fog of war and politics, such messages got buried beneath bureaucracy. The Pacific boiled in silence. Japanese submarines slipped into their positions near Hawaii. On December 2nd, the coded signal was sent: "Climb Mount Niitaka." It was the final order. The operation was a go. On December 6th, President Roosevelt sent a final plea to Emperor Hirohito. "The future of our two nations depends upon peace." But by the time his letter arrived, Japan's strike force was already on the move, engines roaring through icy northern seas under a curtain of radio silence. Before dawn on December 7th, 6 Japanese carriers turned into the wind 230 miles north of Oahu. Pilots ate rice balls in silence. Chaplains recited prayers. Commanders raised their swords toward the rising sun. The fate of the empire rests on this mission. The first wave took flight. 183 planes, engines screaming into the pale dawn. Bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, a symphony of precision and death. Beneath them, the blue Pacific stretched endlessly. Ahead lay Pearl Harbor, a sleeping fortress unaware of its place in history. As they neared Hawaii, radar operators on Oahu detected the incoming planes but mistook them for an American training group. The skies were clear. It was Sunday morning. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell. The world changed in an instant. Fire consumed the battleship Arizona. The Oklahoma capsized. Sailors leapt into burning oil as black smoke coiled into the heavens. In the chaos, an American soldier shouted, "This can't be real!" But it was. The Pacific, once silent, now roared with war. In just 90 minutes, Japan had destroyed or damaged 19 U.S. ships, 188 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 Americans. Tokyo celebrated. Crowds filled the Imperial Plaza waving flags, chanting, "Banzai!" But behind the euphoria, Yamamoto's face remained grave. He murmured words that would echo through time. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The Pacific, once a stage for trade and exploration, had become the arena for humanity's most devastating confrontation. Across the world, dominoes fell. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Roosevelt addressed Congress with the line that would define an era. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. America's factories thundered to life. Men lined up at recruitment offices. Women filled the assembly lines. The arsenal of democracy was born. The Pacific boiled not only with warships, but with vengeance. Courage and destiny, modern historians, reviewing declassified intelligence in 2025, reveal new details. Internal Japanese debates, intercepted signals, and photographs from submarines previously thought lost. The picture grows clearer. Pearl Harbor wasn't just an act of aggression. It was a desperate move by a nation cornered by its own ambitions and the world's constraints. Today, analysts note eerie parallels: resource rivalries in the South China Sea, cyber wars, and nations building military bases on artificial islands. The lessons of 1941 remain urgent. Pride and desperation are volatile allies. The Pacific boiled then, and in many ways, it still does. Morning sunlight broke over the harbor, gilding the waves in gold, unaware that beneath that calm, death was already on its way. It was Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941. At Pearl Harbor, sailors cleaned decks, brewed coffee, and wrote letters home. A band rehearsed for morning colors aboard the USS Nevada. In nearby homes, children ran barefoot through palm trees, their laughter carried by the ocean breeze. Then, the sound of engines. At first, it was mistaken for a drill. Then came the whistle of descending bombs, a sound that would mark the rest of the century. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft screamed from the sky. Torpedoes sliced through the harbor's still waters. Bombs erupted across the decks of battleships anchored in neat rows, ships that moments earlier had symbolized peace, not war. The Arizona took a direct hit. Its forward magazine ignited, detonating with such force that the entire ship lifted from the sea. A sailor later wrote, "The sky turned black with smoke. Men were on fire, jumping into oil that burned on the water." Across the base, chaos reigned. Pilots sprinted to their planes but found runways cratered. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their stations, firing wildly into the sky. Some struck Japanese aircraft. Others hit nothing but smoke and fear. Within minutes, the USS Oklahoma rolled onto her side, trapping hundreds below decks. The West Virginia burned from bow to stern. The ocean that morning was not blue, it was red, rippling with fuel, flame, and bodies. Meanwhile, in Honolulu, a mother shielded her children as glass shattered around their home. Radio stations crackled. "This is not a drill." Repeat, "This is not a drill." By 10 a.m., the attack was over. In less than 2 hours, 403 Americans had been killed. 178 were wounded. 19 ships lay sunk or damaged. The once invincible U.S. Pacific Fleet paralyzed. Across the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat hunched in his wheelchair. face lit by a single lamp. On his desk lay the decoded message, Japan's declaration of war, delivered after the bombs had already fallen. He whispered to his aides, they were still talking peace, while they planned murder. The next day, December 8th, the world held its breath. Roosevelt entered the chamber of Congress, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. The room fell silent as he began. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. His words electrified the nation. Within minutes, Congress voted almost unanimously for war. The sleeping giant had awakened. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill received the news in London. He later wrote, "We had won the war that very night. Japan's attack brought America in, and with her, salvation." In Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, factories converted overnight. Assembly lines that once produced cars now built tanks, bombers, and bullets. Women filled the workforce, Rosie the Riveters, with scarves and steel determination. Posters declared, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Children collected scrap metal. Housewives rationed sugar and gasoline. Soldiers kissed their families goodbye, some for the last time. In Tokyo, the mood was triumphant. Newspapers hailed the victory as divine proof of Japan's destiny. Prime Minister Tojo announced, "We have struck the first blow toward a new world order." But not all shared his joy. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, sat alone aboard the flagship Nagato. He refused celebration. He knew the truth. Japan's moment of triumph had already sealed its fate. "We can run wild for 6 months," he said. "But after that, I fear there is no hope." As winter deepened, the Pacific was aflame. Japanese forces swept across Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed. Hong Kong fell by Christmas. Manila followed. Singapore, the mighty British stronghold, would crumble in February 1942. From the jungles of Burma to the shores of the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun rose over conquered lands. To many Asians, Japan claimed to bring liberation from Western colonialism. But the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere soon revealed its true nature: forced labor, brutality, and hunger. A Filipino woman remembered, "They said they came to free us, but we were only free to die." In just 6 months, Japan had built the largest empire in Asia's history. But every empire, no matter how vast, is built on borrowed time. Even as Tokyo celebrated, its factories strained under shortages of fuel and metal. Allied submarines prowled supply routes. In secret, the U.S. Navy prepared a counterstroke, one that would come sooner than anyone expected. In 2025, historians continue to uncover new evidence about that morning at Pearl Harbor. Decoded intercepts, personal letters, even film reels long thought lost. They reveal moments of extraordinary humanity amid catastrophe. Sailors rescuing comrades from flaming waters, Japanese pilots deliberately steering damaged planes away from civilian targets. The tragedy, it seems, was not driven by hatred alone, but by duty, pride, and the blind momentum of war. Newly restored color footage released in 2026 shows the harbor minutes after the attack, black plumes rising against a serene sky. It's haunting, not because of its violence, but because of its stillness. The world had changed forever, yet the waves kept rolling against the shore. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than a military strike. It was the spark that ignited the global inferno of the Second World War. It united a fractured America, forged alliances that would shape the next century, and began a struggle that would define what humanity was capable of, both in cruelty and in courage. The Pacific was no longer an ocean of peace. It had become the arena for history's greatest gamble and its most terrible reckoning. In early 1942, the Pacific belonged to Japan. The rising sun flew over an empire stretching 6,000 miles, from the frozen Aleutians to the jungles of Burma. It was the fastest military expansion in recorded history. Within months, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had dismantled Western colonial power in Asia, humbling Britain humiliating America and pushing Australia to the edge of invasion. Tokyo called it the New Order in East Asia, but to the millions who lived beneath that flag, it was something else entirely. The shadow of an empire built on fire and fear. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had fallen. British Commander General Percival walked through the ruins of his garrison, white flag raised, to surrender to General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya. 80,000 Allied troops laid down their arms. It was the largest capitulation in British military history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation his nation had ever suffered. The news sent shockwaves through the world. Tokyo celebrated. In the streets, children waved flags, believing Japan had achieved its divine destiny to lead Asia, to purify it from Western corruption, to stand as the empire of the future. But behind that facade of triumph, there was hunger, shortages, exhaustion. Japan's war machine consumed more than its islands could provide: rubber, oil, iron, and food. The Navy burned through its stockpiles faster than anyone predicted. Every drop of fuel taken from conquered lands had to cross oceans swarming with American submarines. Still, in those early months, Japan seemed unstoppable. Manila fell. Rangoon fell. Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, Borneo, all under the red circle of the rising sun. Tokyo's radio declared, "Asia for Asians." The Western Age is over. But even as the emperor's voice echoed through radios from Java to Tokyo, a whisper of doubt spread among Japan's generals, a whisper that would soon become a roar. In the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers made their final stand on the Bataan Peninsula. Starving, outnumbered, and abandoned by reinforcements that never came, they fought with bayonets, rocks, and sheer desperation. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave for Australia. As he boarded a PT boat under the cover of night, he looked back toward the burning coast and swore, "I shall return." When the defenders finally surrendered in April 1942, the Japanese rounded up more than 70,000 prisoners. What followed became one of the darkest episodes of the war, the Bataan Death March. Under blistering sun and relentless beatings, men were forced to march over 60 miles with no food or water. Those who fell were bayoneted or shot. By the time they reached the prison camps, thousands were dead. One survivor remembered, "The road was lined with bodies. Every step was pain. We stopped counting." For America, Bataan was not just a defeat. It was a wound that would not heal until the war's end. But even as Japan celebrated victory, its leaders argued over the next move. Should they invade Australia, strike India, or finish off the U.S. Pacific Fleet? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, knew the truth. The United States was awakening. American shipyards were already launching a new fleet. New carriers, new bombers, new technology, and with it, vengeance. So he devised one more masterstroke, a trap to crush America's spirit before it could fight back. The target, a small remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Its name, Midway. June 1942. The Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward the island, confident of victory. They had more ships, more planes, more experience. But what they didn't know was that America had broken their code. In a secret bunker at Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts had cracked Japan's naval communications. The U.S. Navy knew where and when Japan would strike, down to the hour. At dawn on June 4th, American scout planes spotted the enemy fleet. Carrier decks roared to life. Torpedo bombers launched into the storm of war. One after another, they were shot down. Dozens of young men died without landing a single hit. But their sacrifice drew Japan's fighters away, opening the skies for the next wave. From high above the clouds, American dive bombers screamed down from the sun. In the space of 5 minutes, they changed the course of history. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, erupted into flames. Hours later, the 4th Hiryu was destroyed. Japan's elite airmen, its finest sailors, its irreplaceable carriers, gone. The empire's luck had run out. At Midway, the balance of the Pacific shifted forever. Japan would never again go on the offensive. Admiral Yamamoto bowed his head when he heard the news. His gamble had failed. The very weapon he unleashed at Pearl Harbor had come back to destroy him. In Tokyo, silence replaced celebration. Propaganda called Midway a setback, but inside the Imperial Palace, fear crept into every corridor. The Emperor's advisors began to whisper, "We have awakened a giant we cannot defeat." By late 1942, the war turned. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, American Marines dug into the red mud, facing starvation, disease, and wave after wave of Japanese assaults. The nights were filled with screams and the roar of naval bombardments. Men fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and knives under flares that turned night into blood-red day. After 6 months of relentless combat, the Japanese abandoned the island. For the first time, the empire had lost ground. Guadalcanal became a symbol, a graveyard of Japanese ambition and the birthplace of America's comeback. In the United States, war production reached a scale the world had never seen. Every week, new ships rolled from shipyards. Every day, new bombers took flight. In 1942 alone, America built more aircraft than Japan would produce in the entire war. Women ran assembly lines. Teenagers collected scrap metal. Scientists raced to invent new weapons, radar, proximity fuses, and something darker. Still in secret labs, the atomic project. War was no longer fought by soldiers alone. It was fought by nations. In Asia, Japan's empire strained under its own weight. Resistance movements rose in China, Burma, and the Philippines. Guerrilla fighters harassed Japanese troops, aided by Allied intelligence. Civilians starved. Disease spread. And even within Japan itself, dissent was growing. Letters from soldiers revealed a truth the government tried to hide. Morale was breaking. One Japanese infantryman wrote home, "They told us we fight for honor, but honor does not fill the stomach. I dream of rice." The Empire of Japan had reached its zenith, vast, powerful, and seemingly unshakable. But beneath its surface, cracks spread through its foundations. Every victory came at unbearable cost. Every triumph brought Japan closer to ruin. Yamamoto's gamble had bought glory, but not survival. The Pacific, once Japan's domain, was becoming a graveyard for its ships and dreams. The empire that once expanded like a storm had begun to slow. The ocean that had carried Japan's victories was turning against her. Supply convoys vanished beneath American submarines. Tropical diseases struck down more soldiers than bullets. The tide that had risen with such fury after Pearl Harbor was ebbing away, quietly at first, then all at once. In early 1943, the jungles of New Guinea swallowed entire divisions. On ridges above Buna and Gona, Japanese troops dug tunnels into the volcanic earth, refusing to surrender. Their commanders promised the emperor they would hold forever. The jungle promised only rot, fever, and hunger. American and Australian forces advanced yard by yard, guided by local Papuans who carried the wounded through mud that reeked of death. The battle lasted months. When it ended, almost nothing remained, only ghosts and broken helmets rusting in the rain. Back in Tokyo, the news was disguised as victory. Newspapers spoke of strategic withdrawals, but mothers knew the truth when the telegrams arrived. Each crimson stamp meant a son lost to the sea. Across the Pacific, the United States was transforming war into industry. Liberty ships slid off the docks of San Francisco and Seattle faster than Japan could sink them. The skies above California glittered with new bombers. Every rivet, every bullet, every gallon of fuel crossed the ocean like a promise of revenge. President Roosevelt's words echoed through radios. "We will fight until freedom is secure in the Pacific, on every island, in every sea." By mid-1943, America struck back. In the Solomon Islands, the battle for Guadalcanal became legend, but it was only the beginning. Tarawa followed, an atoll barely 2 miles wide, defended by 4,800 Japanese soldiers who vowed to die to the last man. When U.S. Marines stormed the reefs under withering fire, hundreds were cut down in the surf. Yet they kept coming. 76 hours later, silence. Only 17 Japanese survivors were found alive. A Marine corporal wrote in his diary, "We learned the Pacific isn't measured in miles, it's measured in bodies." In Japan, ration cards replaced rice bowls. Mothers stood in line for hours to buy flour made from acorns. Civilians patched bomb shelters in their backyards and listened to radio bulletins that spoke of glory while air raid sirens whispered of doom. Children practiced with bamboo spears in schoolyards. Dreaming of defending the homeland, the war had become total. Operation Cartwheel, Operation Galvanic, Operation Flintlock, each a new step westward across the ocean. American carriers now ruled the sky. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, became the next objective. Japan knew their loss would open the door to Tokyo itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted beneath a blazing June sun. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft rose from their carriers, uncoordinated, undertrained, outnumbered. American radar saw them coming. The sky turned into a massacre the pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japan lost over 400 planes. Pilots who survived wept when they landed. There were no replacements left to train the next generation. Admiral Ozawa radioed Tokyo. The fleet has ceased to be an effective fighting force. For Japan, the war at sea was already lost, though no one dared speak it aloud. As American troops closed on Saipan, Japanese civilians were told that capture meant torture and death. Propaganda films showed grotesque lies of Allied brutality. When the U.S. Marines reached the island's northern cliffs, they watched in horror as entire families, mothers clutching infants, jumped into the sea rather than surrender. The waves turned white with foam and silence. A Marine chaplain wrote later, "I have seen many things in this war, but never such sorrow." Back in Washington, military planners studied the map. Once the Marianas were secured, new runways could launch the B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft capable of reaching the Japanese mainland. The countdown to the end had begun. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff refused to accept defeat. They built underground command centers and declared the decisive battle for the homeland. Every man would become a soldier, every woman a nurse, every child a shield. Factories turned to caves. Production moved beneath mountains, but fuel was gone. Steel was gone. Food was gone. Only faith remained. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had been killed months earlier, shot down by American fighters who intercepted his flight after codebreakers learned his route. His death was hidden from the public. For many in Japan's Navy, it felt like the soul of the empire had vanished with him. By late 1944, the United States prepared for the return to the Philippines. On Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history unfolded. Over 200 ships, 500 aircraft, and more than 200,000 men locked in a three-day inferno. Japanese commanders launched a final desperate tactic: kamikaze. Young pilots wrote farewell poems, tied headbands of the rising sun, and flew their planes directly into enemy ships. The first strikes stunned the Americans. An officer on the carrier St. Lo remembered the moment a kamikaze hit. The sky turned into fire, and men leapt into the sea wrapped in flame. The Japanese government called them heroes. American sailors called them unstoppable. Between 1944 and 1945, more than 3,800 kamikaze attacks would crash against the Allied fleets. Each one destroyed not just metal, but the hearts of those who witnessed them. On Leyte's beaches, General MacArthur stepped ashore through the surf. Just as he had promised, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Behind him, American divisions fought through jungle and city alike, liberating islands that had been occupied for 3 years. Filipino guerrillas emerged from the hills waving makeshift flags. But for every mile reclaimed, the cost grew heavier. The Pacific was no longer an empire's dream. It was a cemetery without borders. By the winter of 1945, Japan's empire had bled itself dry. Cities at home lay in ruins from relentless firebombing. The once mighty fleet was reduced to fragments. Soldiers on distant islands refused to surrender, living in caves long after the war's outcome was sealed. A diary found on Iwo Jima read, "We are the bones of the emperor's dream." The sea will cover us, but Japan must live. The gamble that began at Pearl Harbor was collapsing. Every decision, every victory, every life spent in the name of destiny now led only to ashes. Yet Japan still would not yield. Its leaders clung to an illusion that one final, glorious battle could force the Americans to negotiate peace. That illusion would soon meet the full weight of the industrial world and the fury of the atom. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean was no longer Japan's shield. It had become the runway of its destruction. From islands once unknown to the world, American bombers now rose in endless waves. Their wings glinted like steel prayers, each one carrying a promise written in smoke. The Mariana Islands, captured at terrible cost, were now America's floating fortresses. Here stood the B-29 Superfortress, a machine built to end empires. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than any aircraft before it. From its belly would fall the fire that would reduce Tokyo to ashes. In February 1945, Operation Meeting House began. 279 B-29s crossed the night sky toward Japan's capital. They carried not high explosives, but cylinders of napalm and magnesium. The order was simple: burn the city until nothing stood. At 12:08 a.m., the first flares fell. Within minutes, the wooden wards of Tokyo erupted into a storm of flame. The wind turned into a hurricane of fire. Rivers boiled. Thousands fled toward bridges that had already melted. A nurse later wrote, "The air itself caught fire. People became shadows on the ground. When dawn rose, more than 100,000 civilians were dead, more in a single night than at Dresden, more than at Hiroshima to come." Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a memory drawn in charcoal. While Tokyo burned, the empire prepared for its last defense. In the caves of Okinawa, soldiers sharpened bayonets and schoolgirls filled bottles with gasoline. For Japan, surrender was unthinkable. For America, invasion seemed inevitable. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific began. 500,000 troops landed on Okinawa's beaches. The battle that followed would define the final chapter of the Pacific War. Rain fell for nearly 3 months. Each hill was fought for and lost, then fought for again. The island became a graveyard of mud and shattered coral. Nearly 250,000 people, soldiers and civilians, would die here. American medics carried wounded through rivers of blood. Japanese doctors worked in tunnels lit by candlelight. One Okinawan mother remembered, "We hid beneath the earth and prayed the bombs would choose someone else." Above them, kamikaze squadrons screamed down from the clouds, 1,900 planes in all. Ships burst like torches on the water. The carrier Bunker Hill burned for hours before her crew could save her. An American gunner later said, "You didn't hate them. You pitied them. They were already dead before they hit us." By June, Okinawa was taken, but at a cost so staggering that even victory felt like loss. Generals stared at casualty lists and realized what an invasion of the Japanese mainland would mean. Perhaps 1 million Allied dead. Perhaps 10 million Japanese President Harry S. Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's death, faced a choice no man had faced before. Scientists in New Mexico had split the atom. The energy of creation had been turned into a weapon. The world stood on the edge of a new age, one lit by a sun not born of heaven, but of man. In July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the Allies issued an ultimatum: unconditional surrender or utter destruction. Tokyo's leaders hesitated. They still hoped the Soviet Union might mediate peace. They did not know that Stalin had already promised to join the war against Japan. Then came August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. The B-29. Enola Gay lifted off at dawn, its bomb bay carrying a single weapon named Little Boy. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell for 43 seconds. A flash brighter than the sun tore through the sky. A fireball consumed the heart of the city. In less than a second, 70,000 people were gone. A doctor wandering the ruins wrote, "I touched a man's shoulder and his skin slid off like wax." 3 days later, Nagasaki, a valley of churches and shipyards, met the same fate. The second bomb, Fat Man, turned the hills to glass. Survivors crawled toward the river, whispering prayers to a sky that answered only with ash. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the first time. His voice trembled through static. "Endure the unendurable, and accept the unbearable." The war was over. Japan lay in ruin. 2/3 of its cities were burned. Millions were homeless. Across the Pacific, soldiers who had survived islands and oceans wept with relief and guilt in equal measure. A pilot over Guam wrote, "The fire is out, but the smoke will never leave us." For the first time in history, humanity had witnessed its own power to destroy itself. The Pacific War had ended, but a new war, the Cold War, had already begun in the glow over Hiroshima. The sky that once carried bombers would soon carry satellites. Nations that once fought for empire would now fight for ideology. And the lessons of the Pacific about pride, technology, and the cost of domination would echo into every century that followed. The city is gone. There are no streets, no people, no sound, only wind. We live among ghosts. Hiroshima survivor 1946. The war had ended, but the peace began in silence. Japan, once the proud empire of the rising sun, was a sea of ash and rubble. 2/3 of its cities were burned. Railways lay twisted, bridges gone. Millions were homeless, widowed, or orphaned. The emperor's divine voice had surrendered, and the myth of invincibility was shattered. Across the land, survivors emerged from the ruins carrying little more than memories. In Hiroshima, a boy pushed a broken bicycle through a wasteland of stone. In Nagasaki, a nun prayed before the remains of her convent's gate, melted into a cross of blackened steel. The smell of war clung to the air. But amid the devastation, something fragile began to stir: the will to live. In 1945, American soldiers arrived not as conquerors, but as custodians of a new future. General Douglas MacArthur, tall, solemn, and iconic in his sunglasses and pipe, became the supreme commander of occupied Japan. His mission: rebuild the nation from ruin, not through vengeance, but through reform. In Tokyo, MacArthur's headquarters, the Daiichi building, became the heart of a quiet revolution. Within its walls, a new Japan was being drafted line by line, word by word. The old constitution, once the foundation of imperial might, was replaced by one that declared, "Sovereignty resides with the people." For the first time in history, the emperor's power was symbolic, not divine. The army was abolished. Women were granted the right to vote. Censorship faded, and newspapers printed freely once again. Factories that once built bombers now forged bicycles, sewing machines, and radios. American engineers taught reconstruction. Japanese ingenuity adapted with astonishing speed. The Marshall Plan may have rebuilt Europe, but Japan's recovery was a miracle of its own making. A former soldier, now a trained mechanic, told a journalist, "We built weapons once. Now we build life. Every hammer strike is atonement." The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal began in 1946. The world watched as the architects of empire faced judgment. 28 men stood trial: generals, politicians, and ideologues. General Hideki Tojo, the face of Japan's wartime government, accepted his fate with chilling calm. When asked if he had regrets, he said, "I only regret that we lost." For many Japanese, the trials were a reckoning. For others, they were humiliation. But beneath the courtroom's tension, a deeper transformation was taking place. A moral rebirth. Teachers began rewriting textbooks. Artists painted not glory but grief. Survivors of Hiroshima spoke publicly, their words echoing through the newly rebuilt radio stations. "We must never again allow our skies to turn into suns." By 1952, the American occupation ended. Japan regained sovereignty, not through war, but through peace. MacArthur left the country quietly, his plane lifting over a skyline reborn. Below him, Tokyo glimmered, not with neon yet, but with hope. In the decades that followed, Japan became something the world had never seen before, a nation that defined itself through peace, not power. The factories roared again, not for tanks, but for technology. The world that once feared Japan's armies now admired its innovation. Radios became televisions. Automobiles bore the names Toyota, Nissan, and Honda. Sony and Panasonic brought sound and vision to millions. In less than 30 years, the land once leveled by bombs became the second largest economy on Earth. But even as prosperity bloomed, the memory of war never vanished. Each August, the bells of Hiroshima toll, not to mourn the past, but to remind the living. At the Peace Park, paper cranes fill the wind, each folded by children who never knew war but inherited its shadow. A survivor once said, "We live to remember, not for vengeance, but for vigilance." The Pacific War had burned across half the globe. It had taken more than 30 million lives. It had shown humanity's brilliance and barbarity in equal measure. And yet from those ashes, Japan found a truth deeper than conquest, that real strength lies not in domination, but in creation. As the world entered the Cold War, Japan became a symbol of peace, a nation reborn from ruin, teaching through example what it means to endure, rebuild, and reconcile. In the end, the rising sun did rise again, but this time, not as a sign of war, but of wisdom. From the ruins of total defeat, Japan rose again, not as a conqueror, but as a creator. The same hands that once forged warplanes now built miracles of peace. Where once stood ashes, now stood neon. Where once burned hatred, now pulsed ambition. Tokyo, 1955. A city reborn. The smell of steel and rain filled the air. Cranes moved like clockwork giants above the skyline. Children played in the shadows of scaffolding where, 10 years earlier, the ground still smoked from war. The world watched, stunned. Japan, the empire that had fallen in flames, was climbing back faster than anyone imagined. This was not merely recovery. This was resurrection. Under the careful guidance of the United States, Japan had become the front line of a new global conflict, not of bombs, but of ideologies. The Cold War had begun. The Soviet Union extended its shadow across Asia. China, now under Mao Zedong, burned with revolutionary zeal. And between them stood Japan, reborn, capitalist, and crucial. For Washington, Japan became the shield of the Pacific, the anchor of American power in Asia. The 1951 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty ensured that American bases would remain across the islands, Okinawa, Yokosuka, Misawa. Soldiers replaced the invaders of the past, this time as guardians of peace. Yet beneath this alliance lay tension, a fragile balance between dependence and sovereignty. Many Japanese protested, "We have rebuilt our nation to live, not to be a pawn again." But as the Korean War erupted in 1950, the American military machine demanded supplies. Japanese factories answered the call. In Osaka and Nagoya, production lines roared once more. Trucks, uniforms, and radios rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. The economy ignited, a phoenix fed by war but not its own. By the 1960s, Japan's miracle was undeniable. The bullet train, the Shinkansen, sliced through the countryside at breathtaking speed, symbolizing a nation racing toward the future. The Tokyo Olympics of 1964 declared to the world, Japan has returned, peaceful, proud, and unstoppable. Foreign journalists marveled at the transformation. In 20 years, wrote one reporter, they rebuilt what others could not in a century. But the miracle came at a price, the quiet sacrifice of generations. Men worked 16-hour shifts. Women filled factories, balancing home and labor. Cities grew too fast. Smog hung over the skyline. Yet even amid exhaustion, there was a sense of purpose, a belief that each life, each job, was part of a greater renewal. A worker in Tokyo once said to an American filmmaker, "We are not rebuilding for glory. We are building so that our children will never know hunger again." And yet, as Japan soared, the memories of war never truly vanished. In the 1970s, the voices of survivors, the hibakusha, grew louder. Their stories, long suppressed by shame and silence, began to shape a new national conscience. Films, poems, and art poured from the trauma. The message was clear. Remember, so we never repeat. At Hiroshima's Peace Memorial, millions came every August. Candles flickered along the Motoyasu River, each flame carrying a prayer across generations. In Nagasaki, schoolchildren learned not just of victory or defeat, but of humanity's capacity for both light and darkness. A teacher's voice recorded in 1972 still echoes today. The lesson of the war is not who won, but what was lost. By the 1980s, Japan was a titan. Its technology led the world: cars, electronics, robotics. The same country that once knelt in surrender now stood as a superpower of innovation. American headlines read, "Japan Inc. is taking over the world." Tokyo's skyline glimmered with ambition. Land prices skyrocketed. Businessmen toasted to endless prosperity. It seemed the island nation had finally conquered the globe, not with armies, but with microchips. But even prosperity has its shadows. The economic bubble of the late 80s burst like an unseen shell. By 1991, the crash sent shockwaves through every sector. Factories closed. Unemployment rose. The miracle had ended, but the spirit endured. Through hardship, Japan learned again what it had always known. Resilience is not in rising, but in rebuilding. And across the ocean, the United States, once Japan's enemy, now its ally, had also changed. The Pacific War had not just reshaped Asia, it had defined America's century. The atomic age, born in Hiroshima, had become the age of deterrence. The Pacific Islands that once burned in battle now hosted bases, radar systems, and fleets. From Pearl Harbor to Guam, the Pacific became a chessboard of power, a fragile piece kept by fear. Yet even into the 21st century, the echoes of that war still shape the world's decisions. When American ships sail through the South China Sea, when Japanese submarines patrol the Philippine Trench, when China and the U.S. exchange warnings over Taiwan, the ghosts of the Pacific War whisper beneath the waves. In 2025, the Pacific is once again a stage of uncertainty. Japan's defense forces, once strictly defensive, are now evolving into a modern military capable of global response. New alliances are forming. The Quad, Japan, the US, India, and Australia stands against rising threats. China, now a naval powerhouse, tests Japan's borders in the East China Sea. North Korea launches missiles that trace the memory of wartime fear across Japanese skies. And the world wonders, are we watching the dawn of another gamble in the Pacific? Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, speaking in Hiroshima in 2025, declared, "Our peace was built on pain. We must not let the embers of history ignite again." Yet beneath diplomacy and peace talks, nations prepare. Submarines dive, radars hum, satellites watch. The Pacific remains the world's most contested ocean, a reminder that history never ends. It only changes form. 80 years after Japan's gamble, the lessons of that war still burn within every wave. The Pacific War was not just a story of nations, and it was a story of humanity, of ambition and arrogance, of invention and insanity. It showed how one nation's dream can light the world or destroy it. It proved that even the mightiest can fall and rise again transformed. Japan's gamble shaped the modern world, its politics, its alliances, its conscience. From the atomic shadow rose a new civilization built not on domination, but discipline. And from its pain, the world learned the fragile cost of progress. The Pacific still remembers the waves that carried. Fleets now carry trade. The skies that once roared with warplanes now hum with satellites. The islands that burned are green again. But beneath it all, the ocean holds its secrets, the rusted bones of ships, the silent echoes of men who never returned, and the eternal reminder that the line between peace and war is as thin as the horizon at dawn. This was the gamble that changed humanity. The Pacific War was more than a chapter of history. It was a warning written in fire, a mirror held to mankind. As we stand in 2026, facing new storms, may we remember the greatest power a nation can wield is the wisdom not to repeat its past. The Pacific, once a theater of blood and empire, is now the heart of a new world. But beneath its calm blue surface, the same old forces stir again: ambition, pride, and fear. 80 years have passed since the guns fell silent, yet the Pacific still defines the destiny of nations. The war that ended in 1945 was supposed to be the last of its kind. Total, apocalyptic, absolute. But in 2026, the Pacific Ocean stands once more at the center of history's map. And the echoes of Japan's gamble, the decision that changed everything, still shape every strategy, every fleet, every speech about peace through strength. In the aftermath of World War II, the Pacific became America's moat, the great expanse protecting its mainland. But now it's a highway, a sea of commerce, conflict, and code. From Tokyo to Taipei, Manila to Sydney, the waves carry cables of data and convoys of oil, the lifelines of modern civilization. More than 60% of global trade flows through the Pacific. It is the beating heart of the world economy, but also its most volatile frontier. China, the rising superpower, builds islands where there were none. Japan, once pacifist by constitution, quietly rebuilds its military strength. The United States, once the liberator of Asia, now defends its dominance in a world no longer certain of its leadership. And all the while, the lessons of the past whisper. Every empire that rose in the Pacific once thought it could not fall. To understand 2026, we must remember 1941. The Pacific War began with Japan's gamble, a nation striking boldly before being strangled by embargoes. It sought to build a co-prosperity sphere, a self-sufficient empire. Today, the echoes are uncanny. China's Belt and Road Initiative and its naval expansion across the South China Sea mirror the same hunger. Control the seas, and you control the future. American analysts call it the return of maritime empires. Except this time, the battleships are aircraft carriers powered by nuclear cores. The soldiers are satellites, the bombs are lines of code. For Japan, the transformation has been subtle but profound. For decades, Article 9 of its constitution forbade war. It declared, "The Japanese people forever renounce the use of force." That clause was written in the ashes of Hiroshima, a promise carved in sorrow. But as threats grew around its borders, that promise began to bend. North Korean missiles began falling into Japanese waters. Chinese Coast Guards sailed too close to the Senkaku. Islands. Cyber attacks targeted infrastructure. In Tokyo, in 2023, Japan unveiled its most ambitious national security strategy since the war, doubling defense spending, acquiring counter-strike capabilities, and forming new military partnerships. In 2025, joint exercises with the United States, Australia, and the Philippines simulated a Pacific blockade. Once again, the Pacific prepared for the possibility of war, a different kind of war, but with the same human cost waiting beneath the surface. It's an irony of history that Japan, the nation once destroyed by war, is now the model of deterrence. Its fleets sail under the rising sun again, not to conquer, but to preserve a fragile peace. Its submarines prowl quietly, its radar eyes never sleep. Yet in the collective memory of Asia, the shadow of the 1940s lingers. In China and Korea, the scars of occupation remain part of education, politics, and identity. In Japan, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki burns as a warning, not a weapon. A historian in Kyoto once said, "The Pacific War never truly ended. It just changed its language." The Pacific has always been more than geography. It's a mirror of human ambition. In 1941, Japan challenged Western domination. In 2026, the Pacific challenges the very idea of global order. The United States, once unrivaled, now shares influence with China, India, and the reborn Japanese state. Russia eyes the Arctic routes, seeking entry to Pacific trade. Meanwhile, the smaller nations, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, navigate between giants, determined not to be colonies again. Each builds fleets, drones, and cyber defense networks. Each remembers the lessons of the past. Alliances can fail, Peace can vanish overnight, and so, the Pacific once again becomes a chessboard, silent, shimmering, and full of risk. The Pacific War taught the world that no gamble in history is ever without cost. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, it believed boldness could overcome fate. But fate, like the sea, cannot be commanded forever. Today, as artificial intelligence plans naval routes, as drones patrol coastlines and satellites watch every wave, the question remains the same. Can mankind master power without being consumed by it? In every sonar ping across the Pacific, there is an echo of Midway. In every alliance formed, there is a memory of betrayal. And in every new weapon tested, there is a reflection of Hiroshima's light. In Tokyo, Hiroshima and Okinawa memorials still stand, not just to honor the dead, but to warn the living. The youth of Japan, born long after the war, now carry a paradox, a future built on remembering. Schools teach about peace, but defense budgets rise. The nation swears never to repeat its past, yet must prepare for it. A university student in 2025 told a journalist, "My grandfather fought in the Pacific." He never spoke of it. But now I study strategy because I fear history is coming back. Yet there is hope, because humanity learns. Slowly, painfully, but it learns. Japan and the United States, once mortal enemies, now lead humanitarian missions together. Japanese engineers rebuild disaster zones in the Philippines. American sailors deliver aid instead of artillery. The Pacific, once the ocean of death, is now the ocean of life, home to trade, communication, and cooperation that binds half the planet. And even as new rivalries emerge, one truth endures. The Pacific remembers both the fire and the forgiveness. When historians look back at the 20th and 21st centuries, they may not speak of a European age or an American century. They will call it the Pacific Century. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, from Tokyo's rebirth to the tech capitals of Seoul and San Francisco, the Pacific has shaped the destiny of humanity. It is the stage where we tested our limits and defined our future. Every empire, every innovation, every ideology of this era traces its roots to that ocean, and at its center stands Japan, once broken, now balanced between memory and progress, between humility and strength. The Pacific War was Japan's greatest gamble. It brought the world to the brink of annihilation, but in its aftermath, it also gave birth to the modern age, to global cooperation, to new technologies, to the understanding that power without peace is nothing. In 2026, as nations once again build fleets, forge alliances, and test the boundaries of deterrence, the question is not whether history will repeat, but whether humanity has learned enough to change its course. Because in the end, the greatest victory is not in conquest, but in remembrance, and the greatest weapon is wisdom. The Pacific is quiet now, no more gunfire, no burning skies, just the steady heartbeat of the tide, carrying with it the memories of those who never came home. 80 years after the last bombs fell, the ocean still guards its secrets. Beneath these waters lie thousands of ships and countless souls, sailors, pilots, nurses, civilians, caught in the fury of mankind's greatest gamble. Their voices are gone, but their echoes remain, whispering through the currents like the tide's eternal hymn. In Hiroshima, the Peace Dome stands beneath cherry blossoms. Children feed doves in the same park where the shadows of 1945 are still etched into stone. In Nanjing, survivors still tell their grandchildren about the winter of occupation, the silence after screams. In Pearl Harbor, divers leave lays in the water above the rusted hull of the USS Arizona. And in Japan's classrooms, students recite poems not of victory, but of remembrance. These are the human fingerprints left upon history, the quiet proof that no war truly ends when the fighting stops. A Japanese nurse, now in her 90s, once said, "I saw the world burn when I was 16. I have spent the rest of my life teaching others how to keep it lit with kindness instead." A U.S. veteran who fought in Okinawa wrote in 2020, "We fought because we had to, but I hope no one ever has to again." The real courage is learning to forgive. And in 2025, a Filipino historian summed it up simply. The Pacific War ended in 1945, but peace is something we must win every single day. For decades, humanity looked back at the Second World War as a story of heroes and villains, victories and losses. But beneath the flags and the maps were faces, millions of ordinary people who simply wanted to live. A mother clutching her child during an air raid, a soldier writing a last letter home, a prisoner whispering a prayer in a cell. They were not the architects of war, yet they bore its price. War was never just about empires. It was, and always will be, about people. And yet, from that devastation, a miracle emerged. Japan, once crushed beneath atomic fire, rose again, not as an empire, but as a beacon of resilience. It traded weapons for wisdom, domination for design, conquest for culture. In the laboratories of Tokyo and Osaka, in the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations, in the art and technology that touch every continent, Japan rebuilt its soul. That is the final chapter of its gamble. The proof that from ruin can come renewal. Today, in 2026, the Pacific Rim glows at night like a constellation of human achievement. Ships carry not soldiers, but semiconductors. Satellites beam not propaganda, but connection. The nations once divided by blood now trade, teach, and innovate together. But peace is not permanent. The same ocean that carried the battleships now carries nuclear submarines. The same skies that saw the Zero and the Mustang now hold drones and hypersonic missiles. And in every leader's speech, one phrase returns: deterrence. It is the vocabulary of fear disguised as safety. The ghosts of the Pacific still whisper, warning that even progress can stumble into peril if memory fades. Each generation must decide what it means to be strong. For some, strength is measured in weapons. For others, in wisdom. In 2026, a new generation walks through Hiroshima's museums with smartphones in their hands, scanning QR codes beside the melted ruins. History has gone digital, but the tears are still real. They look at old black and white photos and realize those faces. The Pacific War reshaped not just politics, but humanity itself. It gave us the United Nations, the nuclear age, the Cold War, and the peace movements that still echo today. It taught us that technology without empathy leads only to ashes. And as the world faces new crises, climate change, cyber warfare, pandemics, the lesson remains. No matter the century, the greatest gamble is always arrogance. The greatest victory is always understanding. In the end, every empire is temporary, but the stories endure, carved into the stones of memorials, written in the letters of the lost, and carried in the hearts of the living. The Pacific War began with a gamble. It ended with a lesson, and that lesson, written in blood, rebuilt in hope, is this: that humanity's future depends not on the power to destroy, but on the will to remember. From the ashes of Hiroshima to the neon skylines of Tokyo, from the soldiers who fell in the jungles of Guadalcanal to the children laughing beside the Pacific today. The story of Japan's gamble is the story of us all, of how far humanity can fall and how far it can rise again. The Pacific War shaped the world we live in. The question now is, will we honor its echoes or repeat its mistakes? May the past be our teacher, may peace be our legacy, and may we never forget the price paid beneath the rising sun.